Welcome to our second lecture on the GDR, this time between 1971 and 1989. Focus is going to be to start with on the politics, basically the very smooth transition from the Ulbricht years over to the Erich Honecker years from 1971 through to 1989. This was seen as almost like a coup, mainly on the insistence of the Soviet leader at that time, Leonid Brezhnev. The fact that Ulbricht was seen as a Stalinist, part of the old regime, obviously meant that he had to go after a while. Having said that, though, Honecker himself was no spring chicken. He'd been a member of the Communist Party from his early days, had spent most of the Third Reich in prison, but had been involved with the setting up the GDR and been involved in a number of different positions, quite high up positions, during the 50s and the 60s. As I say, was involved in the was very much the social pact from the 1970s onwards, which brought in a lot of consumer changes in the GDR, but obviously that had to be paid for, and a lot of that money came from the West, especially from the FRG, and basically the GDR became a lone junkie. The problem then, of course, was in the 1980s when the money wasn't available, and the new leader that realised that changes had to come about in the Soviet Union was Gorbachev, and his alterations to the way the Soviet Union looked to others meant that they had to fend for themselves and find the money for themselves as well. In 1971, initiated a political power struggle which led with the Soviet support to him becoming a new leader, replacing Ulbricht as the first secretary of the SED. Under Honecker's leadership, the GDR adopted a program of what was known as consumer socialism, more consumer goods. It became probably the best place for any sort of consumer durables that was needed anywhere in the Eastern Europe at that time, and that was one of the key things to realise, that although it was falling behind the FRG, it was still ahead of a lot of, if not the most preeminent country in the East. In terms of foreign policy, you had to realise that this was the actual changeover when he comes in was during the period of détente and of Ostpolitik. That meant he had to engage with the Western leaders, Brandt, Schmidt, and later on Kohl. During the period of the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced Glasnost and Perestroika, basically, which meant that he had to take on more responsibility for themselves, develop a more independent policy of looking at not just in terms of internal decision making, but also relationships with others as well. That didn't bode well, mainly because the Honecker himself was still quite hidebound and old guard in terms of his attitude towards the West. What you see is improved growth in the 1960s, but by the time you get to the 1980s, what happens is economic stagnation and financial crisis. We can see this in the statistics here. 96.7% of the net national income was earned by collective enterprises by 1985. The estimate 1984 per capita income was $9,800, compared with $21,000 which was approximately $21,000 in 2008. 1976, the average annual growth of GDP was approximately 5%, which again was nothing to be knocked. It was not that bad. Notable communist East German exports, this is a key thing, people actually wanted to buy East German goods from outside of East Germany, especially in the West, was specifically Praktika cameras and hunting rifles and sextants and wristwatches. They were making things that the West wanted, and this obviously meant it was they could make these products and sell them and keep the dollars for themselves. Until the 1960s, East Germans enjoyed shortages of basic foodstuffs such as sugar and coffee. East Germans with friends or relatives in the West or any access to hard currency and necessary Staatsmark foreign currency accounts could afford Western products and export quality East German products via the Intershop. Consumer goods also were available by post from the Danish Jar Food and other companies similar. Basically, people lived in a socialist society. The key idea was equality and freedom from privilege based on class. There was greater economic equality, subsidised housing and foodstuffs, less emphasis on material prosperity, more on human values. Full employment, everybody had a job, and there were a great number of policies designed to help women. Basically, all legislation that could be a barrier to women's emancipation was repealed, and women's equality was a major aim of the socialist state. We could see this in terms of positive discrimination to counteract outdated beliefs in the woman's role, provision of role models in literature, newspapers, art, history to break down society's resistance to change. And there was a great deal of state support for childcare. Right to decide whether to bear children or not, abortion free and legal up to 12 weeks from 1972. State provision of creches for our young people, you can see there in terms of public creches, GDR 80%, FRG 2%, kindergarten 94%, in the GDR FRG 78%, and after school care GDR 82%, FRG only 4%. Facilities free and state-run are widely available, even at unsocial hours, to suit family factory workers on shifts. By 1989, 1 year of pay equivalent to sickness benefit for their first child, 18 months ditto for second and subsequent children, up to 3 years if no creche place available for the child. However, single mothers, especially supported by the state, positive discrimination, paid training for responsible positions within the firm and organisations. 1 day off per month for had to do housework, home loans for young married couples that were waived with the birth of children. However, there were a number of problems with these policies. Basically, it was the state as nanny. The state would have to make those decisions for women. Women were expected to conform to male working patterns, with the state taking the female role. Women's responsibility for the domestic sphere was reinforced rather than challenged by this legislation. In other words, not only did they have to work in the factories or the offices, they then had to go back and have to do the cooking, etc. Measures all directed at women as mothers, childless women, still viewed as abnormal. Long maternity leaves meant that employing women in responsible roles could be disruptive, and there was a double burden, as mentioned before, for working mothers and wives. The churches had a specific role in the GDR, especially from about 1978. As a result of the Helsinki Accords on human rights, churches were given a more freer role and could actually play a significant role in health and education, running hospitals and old people's homes. They could play a useful role in working with groups such as alcoholics and homosexuals who were denounced by the state, and they started becoming a channel for opposition during the 1980s. There were a number of people who were against the state, sometimes from within the party, more often than not against the party. That doesn't mean to say that those people who were against the party were necessarily right-wingers or free marketeers. A number of them were communists themselves, just didn't like the way it was being done in the GDR. Key people were Wolf Biermann, the GDR's enfant terrible, Jens Reich and Barbara Burley, who were the founders of New Forum in September 1989, and there were, for example, the punks who came through in the 1980s. One of the key problems, if you want to call them that, very much a problem, were the Stasi. This was one of the things that the GDR was very heavily criticised for. Basically, people in the GDR became the most spied upon nation upon earth. Anybody could be tarred with the policies that the Stasi were pursuing, especially in the late 80s, where in fact they had 80,000 official employees and 110,000 to 180,000 informers. That was probably 1 per 60 citizens, including children. They infiltrated each and every dissident group. Various techniques for destroying private lives are used, including blackmail. At least one proven case of an IM marrying and then spying on his own wife. Prisons, the key prison there in Berlin, which was used very, very frequently, especially during the late 70s and early 80s. There are various different ways of trying to interpret what we see in the GDR. Was it part of a totalitarian state, in other words, continuation of the Nazi state? Was it a form of a modernising dictatorship? And how are we supposed to look at people's actual interpretations of having lived there? Each one of those we're going to look at very briefly now. As mentioned before, we could go down the route of just calling it a totalitarian state, a continuation of what we saw under the Nazis between 1933 and 1945. This was a popular interpretation from the 1950s. It stressed the illegitimacy of the Soviet occupation in East Germany state as a puppet state, that everybody was hidebound by the collective, leading role of the ruling party, the Stasi, the secret police. State control of the economy, control of the media, control of the economy. Basically, if we remember what we looked at last year in terms of interpretations of totalitarian states, this ticked all the boxes. The Berlin Wall was another way of using this against the state. This was a way of the state controlling its citizens. Also popular with many former members of the GDR in themselves. This is because it deny personal responsibility. In other words, it was easy to blame what the state did rather than the actions that ordinary people took to themselves. A number of different historians, both within Germany and outside, have taken this stance. How unified was this unity party? Well, there was very few splits in the party elite from mid-1950s until late 1980s. This is due to the forced merger of the SPD and the purging of the Social Democrats and Communists in the 1950s. So it was very top-down and controlling. Renewed support from Moscow for Ulbricht, and even after Stalin's death. Smooth transition from Ulbricht to Honecker in 1971, as mentioned before. Honecker and his mates clung to power and turned the blind eye to dire economic facts and this meant they were out of touch with reality. So that's why you get the rise of opposition from the mid-1980s onwards. Having said that, though, there was no real palace revolution. Nobody actually tried to take on the government directly. What sort of mentalities existed within the party? Basically, they saw themselves as socialists. That meant because they were in the controlling position, there was a great deal of paranoia and suspicions of their own population. Constant talk about the class enemy. Paternalistic, in other words, it looked after its own. Many party members generally cared about the welfare of the people, appearance of public support, a great many people joining the party, but this could be interpreted as a form of careerism. Could it be seen as a modernising dictatorship? This was one way of looking at it. Call it a rational, not an ideological elite. In other words, from about 1970s onwards, because of the new economic system, it was an attempt to try and incentivise the economy. A great deal of technological innovations were created. The special role of the intelligentsia within the GDR needs to be emphasised. Precision engineering in Dresden and Leipzig. Gamble in the 1980s on microchip technology. This was also a welfare dictatorship, indirect use of social power to predispose groups to choose socialism due to things like full employment, hospital, education system. This creates fond memories. Also, we could argue that it was a form of educational dictatorship. The party was in loco parentis, a bit like teachers at our school at the moment. We are in place of your parents whilst you are at school. The party was in charge of in lieu of parents whilst parents were at work. What claims did the state and the party actually make? Well, the communists declared their aim was to produce a new type of man. This is a direct impact on education because of indoctrination and propaganda, and directly on science. A great many things like marches and rallies were used to try and bring about this. This is a key idea, and we will look at this in a great deal more detail later on. This is the idea of a niche society, basically that people did what they had to do in the public sphere, but in the private sphere, they lived their own lives. And to a certain extent, the party accepted that. As long as they towed the line, people would be allowed to sort of occasionally even criticise the party. And this was seen even in the public sphere as well. The party could be criticised through letter-writing campaigns. And this raises the question, how totalitarian was it? What about collective biographies then? This goes down the avenue of people's recollections of living in the GDR. This has led on to things like the idea of nostalgia, the idea that somehow the past was a better place and that there's a nostalgia for the past, and also a variety of different things coming back from the old GDR, including things like gherkins or films made about the GDR. This could be seen as a form of commodifying the GDR. I'll leave you to look at the next few points